A very good evening to one and all present here today. We welcome everyone to the Malcolm Adiseshiah Memorial Lecture by Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust at the M.A. Subbulakshmi Auditorium at the Asian College of Journalism. Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust is dedicated to support economic research, teaching, and development studies. The trust was founded in honor of distinguished economist and educationist, late Dr. Malcolm S. Adiseshiah, and his wife, Elizabeth Adiseshiah. I'd now like to invite Dr. V.K. Nataraj, trustee of the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, to welcome the gathering.
Vanakkam. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you, and especially Professor Prabhat Patnaik, to the presentation of the Malcolm Adiseshiah Award for distinguished contributions to development studies, and also to deliver the Malcolm Adiseshiah Memorial Lecture. The Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, which was founded in 2001, has been conferring this award from 2001 onwards. And the first awardee under this scheme was someone who was later on destined to become a Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee. But the award itself has gone through several evolutionary phases. Initially, it was thought that the award should be given to social scientists specializing in development studies around the age of 50, not only to mark their achievements, but also to spur them on to greater heights. But later on, it was found by us in the trust that this was becoming somewhat impractical, and therefore the age limit slowly started getting extended. And subsequently, in fact, about 4 years ago, it is virtually a new award which is given to social scientists, anyone specializing in development studies, and who has made distinguished contributions to this discipline, irrespective of age, really to signify their achievements in the field. And the first awardee under this new avatar of the award was actually Professor Deepak Nair, and today we have the honor of having Professor Prabhat Patnaik. I would like to welcome you, Prabhat, on behalf of the Trust and on behalf of all of us. I am particularly pleased since Professor Prabhat Patnaik also happens to be a friend of mine. So it's all the greater pleasure on my part to welcome him. The Trust also gives another award to a younger social scientist or a younger development studies specialist. That is the Elizabeth Adiseshiah citation. But this year that citation is not being given because the jury did not feel that anyone met our standards. So it's a very great pleasure that I welcome all of you. And once again, welcome Professor Prabhat Patnaik and also all the distinguished personalities who have assembled here. I cannot mention all of their names, but I'm sure you know who they are. So once again, welcome to all of you. And our great thanks to Asian College of Journalism for organizing this function. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to welcome Mr. Sashi Kumar, Chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which administers ACJ and the auditorium, to introduce the Honorable Awardee.
Thank you very much. I stand here on behalf of ACJ and the Trust, of which I am a trustee as well. And it's a particular distinct privilege for me to be doing the honors on an occasion like this when Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, a long-standing friend and someone I have admired all these years, is the recipient of the award. I must say at the outset that the award coming to Dr. Patnaik so late, I think Dr. Nataraj has already explained the context because of initially the award was meant for a particular age group. And therefore I think the award itself it becomes enhanced in value and prestige by the fact that the recipient this year is Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, who is one of our best known thinkers, economists, public intellectuals, I would say not just nationally but internationally. I would, in my own mind, and I'm not speaking here as a trustee of the trust of Malcolm Adiseshiah Trust. It is a bit like the Booker of Booker Awards, if you like. I would think that we should probably have named it that when we give it to Dr. Prabhat Patnaik. But it's indeed a very, very rare and distinctive occasion in that sense. Dr. Prabhat Patnaik is a person we cherish all the more today because we are living in a time when intellectualism, academic rigor and quality are all under fire in some form or the other, partly because of the market forces which kind of are so tempting that they are compromised, partly because of the lure of opportunistic kind of lure that is around us. And in this challenging situation or environment, to find someone who retains and sustains the rigor, academic rigor, intellectual rigor, and who manifestly professes to be and practices the traditions of Marxism. I mean, Dr. Prabhat Patnaik is known first and foremost as a Marxist economist, and I think that's not something he shies away from. In fact, he takes great pride in it, and he pursues that Marxist thinking. So it's very rare, therefore, to find someone like him. I think in order to understand his particular unique place is to remember what Pierre Bourdieu, who of course belongs to a different tradition, if you like, a more conservative tradition, who was the chairperson of the College of the Arts in France, spoke about the idea of heteronomy. He said a heteronomous individual is one who is compromised either by the laws of the market or by the lure of the media, the temptation of the media. And we speak, of course, we are in a journalism college, and the media can often water down intellectualism. So I would argue that we have, therefore, in our midst, this is not to name anyone or to put down anyone, but a category of intellectuals who are more media-made than made by the rigor of their work or what they do. So I would put, of course, Dr. Patnaik in that category of very rigorous intellectuals and academicians who have been trailblazing in many ways. I remember when I was first introduced to Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, he was, of course, in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, I think which he joined almost at the very outset as an assistant professor, and then we went on to become a professor there. His classes were the stuff of folklore in JNU, because if Prabhat was holding a class, it was not just students of the department who attended, but students across the social sciences in the university, and the auditorium or the classroom was bursting at its seams. And so he has, that's the image, and it's remarkable that he's managed to keep that reputation, that popularity, the influence in policy circles, in the corridors of power as well, alive consistently without compromising an inch on his core beliefs and values. Prabhat Patnaik is taught at the center, as I said, at the CESP, and he taught there for a long time, from 1974 until his retirement in 2010. He continues to be Professor Emeritus of Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he was born on the 19th of September 1945 in Jatni in Orissa. And many years ago, in the early years of the ACJ, he was the chief guest at our convocation, and when Orissa was mentioned, this sparked off a memory. And I remember his saying his two valuable contributions in that convocation address. One, which were very prescient at that time. One, that he said journalism inexorably will tail the way finance capitalism takes it. That's a problem. When journalistic values are aligned with those of finance capital, they do very well. But when they try to challenge them or go against the grain of finance capital, you will find that journalism will stutter, and that's when the true guts, or shall we say, the rebellious nature, the speaking truth to power nature of journalism should emerge. And he was skeptical about how journalism can hold up to that kind of a situation. And true enough, we know that one of the big problems we face in journalism today, in the media today, is that it is largely compromised. It has, in many cases, laid itself supine before power instead of speaking truth, not or even interrogating or criticizing power in any substantial or reasonable sense. And the other, interesting comparison Dr. Patnaik spoke about at that time was the arrogance of journalism. That we think that the world revolves around us. And he said it's like there's a saying in Orissa, a proverb in Orissa, in Oriya rather, which says that the dog which walks under the bullock cart, under the shade of the bullock cart, thinks it is actually taking the bullock cart forward. So, that kind of self-obsessive sense of importance, and it just came to my mind. So he's from Orissa, and after his early schooling in his hometown, he studied at the Delhi College in Indore on a Government of India merit scholarship. He's been a scholarship student through most of his, student years. His father, Prananath Patnaik, was a communist leader and a member of the Legislative Assembly. Prabhat Patnaik passed his BA with economics honors from the St. Stephen's College in Delhi and completed his MA from the Delhi School of Economics, after which he went to the University of Oxford, that was in 1966, on a Rhodes Scholarship, and studied at the Balliol College and later at Nuffield College. He obtained the Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Balliol College and later at Nuffield College. He obtained his B.Phil and PhD degrees from Oxford in 2012. He was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Science in Economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in the University of London. Prabhat Patnaik joined the Faculty of Economics, as we mentioned, of the University of Cambridge, UK in 1969, and was elected a Fellow of the Clare College, Cambridge in 1974. Elected a Fellow of the Clare College in Cambridge. In 1974, he returned to India as an associate professor at the newly established Center for Economic Studies and Planning, which I just mentioned, at the JNU, and he became a professor of the center in 1983, teaching there till his retirement in 2010. He was also the vice chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board from June 2006 to May 2014, where he blazed a trail in terms of a number of policy initiatives which were of benefit to the common man, and I think that was a very eventful period, his chairmanship in the Kerala State Planning Board. A prolific scholar, Prabhat has written a number of books and articles, and his books include Time, Inflation and Growth, published in 1988, Economics and Egalitarianism, 1990, Whatever Happened to Imperialism and Other Essays, in 1995, Accumulation and Stability Under Capitalism, 1997, The Retreat to Unfreedom, 2003, The Value of Money, 2008, and Re-Envisioning Socialism, 2011. For students of ACJ, many of his books are in our library if you haven't found that out already. Over close to 5 decades, he has written a regular weekly column titled Economic Notes in the People's Democracy, the PD, which is a weekly newspaper of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. He's also the editor of the journal Social Scientist. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, and I heartily welcome him to this occasion and introduce him to you formally.
Thank you, sir. As a token of our gratitude and appreciation, we would like to honor the awardee, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, with a traditional ponadi and a bouquet. I now request Anish and Aditi to welcome him on our behalf. Now, I request Professor A.R. Venkatachalapati, trustee of the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, to deliver the citation of the Malcolm Adiseshiah Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies.
Vanakkam. Good evening. It is my singular honor to read out this citation for the award being presented to Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Just want to preface this with a few words. I was a student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University Center for Historical Studies in the early 90s, and I have seen with my own eyes the respect that Professor Prabhat Patnaik commanded not only among his students but also his colleagues. And so heartwarming to see intellectual excellence being honored and respected. So it is my singular privilege to read out this citation. The Malcolm Adiseshiah Award 2022 presented to Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Professor Prabhat Patnaik is internationally recognized as an outstanding economist and as a public intellectual, having received acclaim in both these roles. His research has been largely in the development and application of macroeconomic theory. The approach in his early work was Marxian. His subsequent work incorporated the insights of Keynes and Kalecki. He has successfully deployed this method to account for macroeconomic outcomes in India for over 4 decades. He remains one of India's few heterodox economists. In an article written early in his career, Professor Patnaik applied the Marxian idea of a disproportionality crisis triggered by unbalanced expansion of the productive sectors of an economy to explain the growth process in India. This article, titled Disproportionality Crisis and Cyclical Growth, a theoretical note published in the Economic and Political Weekly 1972, was able to account for inflation in a slowing economy. It may be noted that it was written before the oil shocks of the 1970s, a time when Keynesian economics was described as facing a crisis due to its inability to explain the stagflation that engulfed the industrialized economies of the West. A second important paper in a continuing research program aimed at explaining the development of India's economy, when Professor Patnaik was to explain the source of aggregate demand for high growth in a time of worsening income distribution in India during the early 2000s. Titled A Model of Growth of the Contemporary Indian Economy, it appeared in the Economic and Political Weekly in 2007. Between these two studies and since, there has been a plethora of writings on the macroeconomic aspect of the Indian and world economies, notably on the role of finance. In recognition of this work, following the global financial crisis of 2008, Professor Patnaik was nominated by the United Nations to a committee tasked to propose the architecture for a stable and just international economic order. Prabhat Patnaik has been the relatively rare economist among India's public intellectuals. His media appearances and written commentary in the media were followed for both their content and critical stance. His role as an educator and teacher merits special mention. From the time that he was a young lecturer at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he has taught throughout his career, his lectures were sought after for their brilliance and performativity. In recognition of Prabhat Patnaik's contribution as a professional economist, unparalleled teacher, and an engaged citizen, a jury consisting of Professor Pulapre Balakrishnan, Professor Kamala Ganesh, and Professor Vishnu Mahapatra have nominated him for the Malcolm Adiseshiah Award for Distinguished Contribution to Development Studies for the year 2022, presented this day on February 10th, 2023. Please join me in congratulating Professor Patnaik.
Thank you, sir. Now, for the highlight of the day, we will have the Malcolm Adiseshiah Memorial Lecture on the topic For a Set of Constitutionally Guaranteed Economic Rights by our Honorable Awardee, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Prabhat Patnaik.
Mr. Chairman, the assembled dignitaries, friends. First, of course, I'm really overwhelmed by the comments which have been made about me by the previous speakers. At the same time, I must confess, an award like this fills me with mixed feelings. Of course, I'm delighted that my work is receiving recognition. I'm elated by it. At the same time, any such award is, after all, the celebration of an individual. But the individual is really a collective product. The ideas which I have put down over the years are ideas which may be attributed to me, but I have got those ideas through discussions with friends, through discussions with colleagues, through discussions with all kinds of people. So in a sense, those ideas are not ideas that just came to my mind, but they're ideas which I have really acquired over the years through a whole set of social and intellectual interactions, because of which, as I said, me as an individual is a product of a collective to which I belong, and therefore, in a sense, I feel that I'm receiving this award under false pretenses. But all these mixed feelings really pale into insignificance when I remember that this is by the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, because Professor Malcolm Adiseshiah was my grand teacher. My teacher, Professor K.N. Raj, was in fact a student of Professor Malcolm Adiseshiah. So in a sense, he is really my grand teacher. And of course, it's a pleasure and privilege for me that an award associated with his name has been given to me. The topic on which I am supposed to speak today, or which I have chosen to speak on, is for a set of constitutionally guaranteed economic rights. The Indian Constitution is in fact a wonderful document. The fact that in a society which is characterized for millennia by the institutional inequality of the caste system, you actually have a constitution that guarantees, that provides for equality before law, that provides for universal adult franchise, is really nothing short of a revolutionary transformation. As a matter of fact, France, which was the classic country of bourgeois revolution, introduced universal adult franchise only in 1945. And that too in the local elections. While in India, 1952 is when we actually had the parliamentary elections based on universal adult franchise. So it's really a remarkable achievement, and the constitution on the basis of which this achievement was made possible is really a remarkable, outstanding document, which must be cherished. But at the same time, I cannot help feeling that there's an anomaly at the heart of the Indian Constitution. And that anomaly consists in the fact that all the provisions regarding an improvement in the material lives of the people are provisions which are consigned to what are called the directive principles of state policy, which are not justiciable. As a result, they really are no more than pious wishes. Now, many jurists disagree with this. I have heard the late Justice P.B. Sawant, for instance, saying that no, the directive principles have a force which is really on a par with what the fundamental rights have. But this is not a verdict which the judiciary has ever given. So we have to remain content with the fact that the directive principles are really no more than just pious wishes. Now, this is also rather sad because of the fact, quite apart from the fact that this really disempowers citizenship, because a citizen is a person, citizen of the country, should in fact be empowered to a certain material standard of life, a certain material standard of education, and so on. The fact that this entails a disempowerment of citizenship, the fact that it is also humanly tragic, because to this day we have a continuation of acute poverty in this country 75 years after independence. This is also in a certain sense a betrayal of the promise of the anti-colonial struggle. The Constitution is really based upon promises which were made in 1931 in the Karachi Congress resolution. Many of the constitutional provisions go back to the 1931 Karachi Congress resolution, and in that resolution it was clearly said that every Indian must be entitled to a certain minimum standard of life. Unfortunately, that standard of life still has not been provided till date. Even Jawaharlal Nehru, in his introductory speech to the Constituent Assembly, has really said that the task of this assembly is to work out a constitution that would give everybody fundamental rights, including the right to economic freedom. The term economic freedom was generally used to denote reduction in inequality and an improvement in the standard of life of the poor people of the country. So the fact that the Constitution has not really fulfilled the promises on the basis of which both the anti-colonial struggle was conducted and the promises which were really even carried over after independence is really a kind of striking, unfortunate phenomenon. Some may say that I am being rather pessimistic on this. After all, there is an improvement taking place in the conditions of people's existence, and therefore, sooner or later, all this poverty and so on would disappear. This, I regret to say, is not correct, because if you really look at simply the elemental definition of poverty, namely nutritional norm, according to a nutritional norm, then you find that the Planning Commission itself had postulated a nutritional norm of 2,200 calories per person per day as constituting the kind of, definition of poverty. If you can't access 2,200 calories per person per day, you were to be counted as poor. If you did access that much or more, then of course you were not poor. Now, if you take that, and that's in rural areas, if you take that constitution, that norm of the government, of the Planning Commission, then you find that the proportion of people who could not access 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India was 58% in 1993-4. This proportion increased to 68% in 2011-12. For urban areas where the corresponding norm was 2,100 calories per person per day, the figures were 57% and 65% respectively. So obviously, by this elemental definition of poverty, you find there has been an increase in poverty. And what is more, in 2017-18, the increase was even greater, so much so that the current government suppressed the data relating to the 2017-18 National Sample Survey, on the basis of which I'm making all these statements about data. The NSS findings for 2017-18 were literally suppressed. And since then, there has been not only no further NSS quinquennial survey, but what is more, the NSS surveys of the old kind are apparently going to be discontinued. And so whatever Professor Prashant Chandra Mahalanobis and his team had worked out as the basis for Indian statistical system is something which has been given a burial precisely because of the fact that they throw up material and data which are unpalatable to the existing government. So the point is that, waiting for the fruits of this growth to percolate down to the people is like waiting for Godot. So that is something which cannot be accepted, and besides, it is against the very dignity of citizenship. A citizen of India should have a certain minimal standard of life. Now, this is also not beyond reach. As a matter of fact, I made some calculations together with a colleague, and those calculations suggest that if we have a set of 5 fundamental, universal, justiciable economic rights, and these rights, therefore, do not appear as the largesse on the part of the state. They do not appear as things where one set of population, one group can be played off against another group. We actually think in terms of a universal, justiciable set of economic rights, and we took only 5 rights. The right to food, which basically means that whatever is now available to the so-called BPL population should be universally available. The right to employment, failing which the person who has been denied such a right would be paid a full wage, which is specified beforehand, and the wage should vary according to the level of skill of the person. So a right to employment, a right to free, quality, universal health care along the lines of a national health service as exists, for instance, in the United Kingdom, and not health insurance. So if you have a right to universal health care of that kind, a right to free, quality, universal education for everybody, at least up to, for the time being, the higher secondary level, and of course a right to old age pension and disability benefits. At the moment, you'd be shocked to know that the old age non-contributory pension, which the government of India gives, is 200 rupees per month, which is ridiculous. In fact, the non-contributory old age pension should be a living pension, which would mean about 3,000 rupees a month, and of course, disability benefits. And this is for those who are not, who may opt out of it or who may not be eligible for it because they are on other institutional pension schemes. So if you count basically these 5 rights, then the total expenditure required for instituting these 5 rights, according to our calculations, came to about 16% of GDP, 16% of the total gross domestic product of the country. Now, already a certain amount is being spent on all these heads anyway. If you take the additional amount that is really required to be spent on all these to institute these rights, then that comes to about 10% of the GDP to be spent by the center and the states together. Now, if you wish to spend 10% of GDP, then you don't actually have to raise taxes amounting to 10% of GDP. There is a well-known theorem in economics called the theorem of the multiplier, according to which, as the government spends, incomes accrue to people, and some of the incomes that accrue to people in the various rounds come back to the government as taxes, and therefore the additional tax revenue to be raised by the government for spending 10% of the current GDP as additional expenditure in order to institute these rights is about 7% of the GDP. This 7% can be raised by having just 2 taxations. One is a 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of the population, only on the top 1% of the population, a 2% wealth tax, and a 1/3 inheritance tax, again only on the top 1% of the population. Now, how mild these taxes are can actually be gauged by looking, for instance, at the proposals which were being made in the context of the United States. In the last presidential elections, for instance, two candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, proposed wealth taxes. Bernie Sanders proposed a progressive wealth tax going up to 7% on the top bracket, 7% of wealth, and Elizabeth Warren suggested just a two-slab wealth tax, 1% and 2%. While what we are suggesting is a 2% wealth tax, but only on the top 1% of the population. If you have a wealth tax, then you must have an inheritance tax. Otherwise, people would simply distribute their wealth among their children, and therefore they would escape the tax net. So an inheritance tax is something which is really complementary to the wealth tax. And a 1/3 inheritance tax is something which is extremely light. Japan has an inheritance tax in the form of when a person dies, then Japan has a tax that takes away 50% of the person's wealth. Even in the United States, Britain, all over Europe, you have inheritance taxation that would amount to roughly about 40%. While in comparison, what I am suggesting is a 1/3 inheritance tax, and that too only on the top 1% of the population. Now, an inheritance tax is something which is really in sync with the logic of capitalism. As a matter of fact, the typical defense of capitalism that is put forward by those who defend capitalism, by its kind of advocates, is that the capitalists get their wealth, they get these big profits and so on, because they have some specific talent. That the wealth they have, the huge incomes they get, is because they are talented people. They have got some qualities which everybody doesn't have. Therefore, there's really a reward for those qualities. What these qualities are is something on which there is a difference of opinion among different writers. The English economist Alfred Marshall thought that the capitalists really saved, and for making savings, every act of saving is really, according to Marshall, an act of waiting. That instead of consuming 100 rupees today, I really wait to consume the amount day after tomorrow. And therefore, it is this patience, this act of waiting for which they had to be rewarded. Eugene von Bauer, who was an Austrian economist, actually argued that it is that human beings are endowed with a time preference. That basically between 1 rupee tomorrow and 1 rupee today, they would like to have 1 rupee today rather than tomorrow, because of the fact that there is a kind of time preference, that therefore 1 rupee today is worth in their eyes less than 1 rupee tomorrow. And therefore he thought that those who got these capitalist profits were people who overcame this time preference, or a compensation had to be given to them for overcoming this time preference, and which is why the capitalists got their profits and their wealth and so on. Joseph Schumpeter thought that really this is a reward for innovation. The capitalists are innovative people, and because of that they had to be rewarded. They put together new products, they put together new processes and so on. But all these people would be agreed that even though the capitalists have to be rewarded for this, their children have to show some talent before they get entitled to get such a reward. Therefore, the capitalists must not be allowed to pass on their property to their children, because then the children are getting it for doing nothing. Therefore, if the capitalist's property is a reward for a particular talent, then this talent has to be exhibited by the children as well before they can be entitled to acquire such property. That being the case, really speaking, there is no reason why people should be allowed to pass on property from one to the other, from father to the son. Now, this is something which is, as it were, therefore, in sync with the logic of capitalism, in sync with the ethics that even those who defend capitalism really would agree with. Now, we are only suggesting a one-third of inheritance taxation on property that is passed on from one generation to the next, and that too only on the top 1% of the population. Now, this is something which is really, I've made some calculations which are there in the lecture. I don't want to go through it now. The moment so if you do this, then it amounts to saying that really even a certain light taxation of the top 1% of the population would be quite enough to institute these 5 fundamental economic rights. And of course, these 5 fundamental economic rights in turn would be enough to convert, to ensure that we build a welfare state in this country. Now, of course, the rights discourse is something which has been attacked both from the left and from the right. From the left, Karl Marx himself was not in favor of the rights discourse. There's a lot of discussion on this about what Marx's attitude was to the question of rights. But on the other hand, in his well-known essay called On the Jewish Question, Marx criticizes individual economic rights on the grounds that really individual economic rights are conferring something on the individual. The idea is to build a society which entails the creation of a new community. Socialism would actually mean the creation of a new community. And therefore, if we are talking about the creation of a new community, then talking about individual rights is a distraction. That really emphasizing the individual as a beneficiary of certain rights is a distraction from the entire task of building a community, of a socialist struggle. Now, of course, Marx was writing at a time when, in fact, talking about rights would have been a distraction, because he was writing at a time when a revolution appeared to be on the horizon in Europe. He was writing at a time when collective struggles of the working class were really building up. In fact, these collective struggles of the working class meant, in an embryonic form, the coming into being of a new community, which is then going to become the core of socialism. And consequently, it made sense, as far as Marx was concerned, to be critical of individual economic rights. But on the other hand, we now live in a world in which, of course, we cannot say with any confidence that there is a socialism beckoning to us on the morrow, and that the agenda of socialism is really immediately here. In other words, it may take a very long time before we can really reconstitute the socialist, reconfigure the socialist agenda. And what is more, what is more, even for creating a collective fighting for individual rights is something which could be a way of generating that kind of sense of community. And therefore, one cannot really take the objections which Marx had raised in his essay on the Jewish question as seriously today, when we are really discussing the question of individual rights. There are a lot of scholarship that actually argues that no, Marx himself demanded rights. For instance, he demanded the right of the worker to join a trade union, and so on. I wouldn't go into that. The second kind of attack on the right, on economic rights, which actually comes, is from the right. And that, for instance, in the writings of philosophers like Dworkin, which actually says that, look, you cannot institute a right unless the state is in a position to actually guarantee that right, to actually provide that right. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And therefore, for instance, you cannot have a right to employment for everybody because we live in a social arrangement where full employment is really not possible. So that being the case, what's the point in instituting a right that you really cannot meet? Now that seems to me, however, to be an erroneous belief, because that is, as it were, putting the cart before the horse. I mean, the whole idea should be that the dignity of citizenship should not be made secondary to the social arrangement in which we happen to be. Rather, we should have such social arrangements as would ensure the dignity of citizenship. Therefore, the individual rights cannot be made conditional upon what capitalism allows or does not allow, but rather whether we have capitalism or a mixed economy, or we have kind of state capitalism or dirigist regime and so on, or socialism. These are choices which people have to make on the basis of which of these arrangements can actually fulfill the fundamental economic rights. Therefore, to take the kind of position that people like Dworkin take is to accept capitalism as a given phenomenon and to tailor what the state can give to the citizens, or what the constitution can give to the citizens, only on the basis of what capitalism allows. But that, I believe, is an erroneous procedure. But of course, therefore, while the arguments against the institution of fundamental economic rights are, to my mind, not very persuasive, the question may be asked, what is the argument for? Okay, obviously there is an argument for, insofar as the fact that you have fundamental political rights, and therefore you must have fundamental economic rights on a par with political rights in order to confer on everybody the dignity of citizenship. But beyond that, can we say anything? Why do we have fundamental political rights? The question can be raised, why do we have fundamental political rights? Why do we have a right to freedom of expression? What is there that actually tells us that we must have a right to freedom of expression? Well, the answer to this lies, the philosopher's answer to this lies in the fact that the right to personal freedoms of various kinds, including the freedom of expression, is to provide autonomy to the individual. And the individual must be provided autonomy because the individual uses reason. That basically human beings are marked by the fact that they are capable of using reason. Now, if you use reason, then you require autonomy. And if you require autonomy, this autonomy can be guaranteed only by providing the right to personal freedoms, including freedom of expression and so on. But I believe exactly a similar argument can be made for economic rights. In fact, Akhil Bilgrami has made this argument in a paper in which he says that, that what economic rights give you is human vitality, that ability to function in accordance with certain basic kind of, health, that you have the health, you have the nourishment, you have the education and so on to be able to function with the required degree of vitality in society. I would like to stretch this point to say that really the exercise of reason, the ability to exercise reason, which underlies the fundamental political rights that constitutionally get enshrined, also implies the ability to act in accordance with the exercise of reason. And the ability to act in accordance with exercise of reason is something which requires a certain vitality of functioning, and that is made possible only if you provide a set of fundamental economic rights. This is, I believe, an immediate, essential thing. I'm not saying that this can be done easily, but I'm saying whenever an opportunity arises, we all demand specific welfare measures. But I think it's very important to demand not just specific welfare measures, but a set of fundamental economic rights so that these welfare measures cannot just be withdrawn at the will of the government. They do not become a largesse on the part of the government, but they are actually enshrined in the Constitution itself. And in order to do that, we have to really create an intellectual basis for this argument right from now. And that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll now open the floor for questions.
Thank you.
So you spoke about a 2% wealth tax on the 1% and a 1/3 inheritance tax, which would guarantee the economic rights of food, employment, and health. For such a tax, what are the current impediments, especially on a policy level, to implementing this?
Okay, 2 or 3 things which I didn't get time to go into. Let me just clarify. Firstly, all of us have a mistaken idea about resource mobilization. You know, I used to have this. You see, we think that when you put a tax, let's say you tax 100 rupees and the government taxes 100 rupees and spends 100 rupees. The belief we have is that the 100 rupees of taxes release resources worth 100 rupees, and the 100 rupees of expenditure take up those resources. But that's not actually it ever happens, because a lot of the taxes come out of savings, which basically means that there is no resources being released. And what is more, the resources which are released through taxes are not identical with the resources which are required for expenditure. So the real point is that even if you have taxes being matched by expenditures of the government, there would still be the possibility of inflation, because there would still be the possibility that you create excess demand for some commodities and so on. And therefore, making such a suggestion, which I am doing, is something which is conditional upon the availability of sufficient slack in the economy, unutilized capacity, unsold food grain stocks, and so on. Now, the Indian economy has been characterized by such slack for a very long time. You know, there was one time when we had 100 million tons of food grain stocks lying around. So, given the fact that we have this slack, if we have the institution of these rights, when I say they have to be financed and equivalent amount of taxes have to be raised, the real function of those taxes is to prevent wealth inequality building up. You see, because if you just spend 100 rupees but not tax 100 rupees, then those 100 rupees accrue as savings to all kinds of private people. Their wealth goes up for doing nothing. They're sitting at home, but their wealth goes up. And therefore, really speaking, taxation is required to keep the wealth inequality down. Okay, that's the first thing. Secondly, I'm really talking at a macro level, including the center and the states. Obviously, when you spend 100 rupees, suppose you say right to education, a lot of the education is provided by the state government. So you have to have a distribution of these resources between the center and the states so that really the constitutional provision of the division of responsibilities really is respected. So the point, so those are, as it were, the nitty-gritty of instituting these rights. And I'm hoping that some people would get inspired in order to work out these nitty-gritty. I mean, I'm not in a position to, I can only do some macroeconomic calculations. But fundamentally, I believe we should think in terms of these ideas.
So you said that the possibility before us in a situation where there is no actual change in the social system in the near future is a collective struggle for individual rights, individual economic rights. But then how would we tackle the impact of the existing hierarchical social system, the social hierarchy on that struggle? I mean, how would we cancel out that influences that would come in that struggle?
You see, we have already, if you remember Ambedkar's last speech to the Constituent Assembly, we have already, by having a constitution that provides one person, one vote, already gone halfway in tackling that. I come from a village, and I'm old enough to have been conscious in 1952 when the first elections took place. And you have no idea the kind of anger which my village was a Brahmin-dominated village. They were all landlords. The kind of anger that they felt that their vote had the same value as the vote of that, Dalit. So already we have tackled that, and I believe we have to carry that forward. If we want to build an egalitarian social society, and mind you, democracy requires such an egalitarian society. One of the reasons why even people like Thomas Piketty, who are really, he is not a socialist, even people like Thomas Piketty are worried about wealth and income inequalities widening, is because they see this as subverting democracy. Okay, so we have to take this on, and obviously it is not the case that everybody would come with you, but as long as you can mobilize enough people, we can carry this forward.
Good evening, sir. My question is regarding the 2% wealth tax and 1/3 inheritance tax. In that situation, there will be a time when the population would increase, and at that time, the number of people for whom the economic rights will have to be guaranteed, the cost will also increase. So at that time, we'll have to progressively increase the 2% mark for the top 1%. So would there be a time where the economic rights of the rest 99% will have to be dependent on the increasing incomes of the top 1%, because we need to keep taxing that? At that time, that dependence will still exist, sir.
No, I'm not saying that the institution of economic rights should be conditional upon this 2%. I'm simply giving the figure of 2% just to show that it is feasible. Okay. The idea of having fundamental economic rights is an independent idea. Okay. Now, of course, when you're talking about population increasing, you're also talking about wealth increasing. Okay. And if social wealth increases, even assuming the same distribution of social wealth, you would actually find that 2% would be quite enough. Per capita wealth increases, will be quite enough.
Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik. Now, your plea for creating an egalitarian society through these 5 rights are deeply challenging. At the same time, it challenges us to rethink rights itself. Because the discourse of rights, is it in the same situation as it was in 1848 in Marx's time? My query is that we are enriched by linking rights not only to justice but responsibility as a part of trigonometry of critique, creativity and transformation. Thinking about rights then, in philosophy of rights, there is the age-old discussion of rights and good. Both Rawls and Habermas, speaking on, Kant have spoken about it. But the challenge is not to be imprisoned within a dualism of right and good, but how do we bring right and good together? It is in that spirit, the proposal of 1% taxation of the rich.
Top 1%.
The top 1%, it requires a kind of social dialogue, for example. Along with state politics and policy, there is the need for a social dialogue. Speaking about Dworkin's question of equality as a right, Professor Bethe many years ago brought the question of equality as a right and equality as a policy. Because equality as a right is not necessarily accompanied by equality as a policy. So my query is that the road to equality is not only just rights discourse, but how do we think of equality as a policy, equality as a politics, equality as morality, and equality as spirituality? My final query is that your reference to collective and individual is also requires a rethinking. How do we have a collective which is not collectivistic, and how do we have an individual which is not individualistic?
You know, when I'm talking about for a set of fundamental economic rights, I'm not visualizing a solution to all human problems. You know, I'm only making a very limited statement. Okay, I'm a socialist. Okay, as you know, so the point is, how exactly from a rights discourse we move towards socialism and so on are issues which need much working out, even for me. Okay, I really believe that even in a socialist society, it becomes very important to have individual rights. In other words, one of the problems with the old socialism is that it did not have individual rights. I think while the individual is a part of the collective and the individual acquires his or her freedom through the actions of the collective, but at the same time, the individual must have rights which the collective should not encroach upon. Okay. Now, if that is the case, in that case, the dialectic between the individual and collective would continue, even in socialism. But insofar as we are not talking about socialism, the very idea of instituting rights is a way of activating collective action. We have collective action for MG and REGS. We have collective action for trade unions, for higher wages. Why can't we have collective actions for the institution of a set of fundamental economic rights? Now, your question about dialogue. The point is, when we had land reforms, we didn't have dialogues with the landlords, did we? I mean, you know, there was not. As long as there is you see, no, as I mentioned, even true blue bourgeois writers would have no problems at all with inheritance and wealth taxation. Even true, certainly with inheritance taxation, not at all, and even with wealth taxation, there are plenty of writers who swear by capitalism, including John Maynard Keynes himself, who actually said that the current levels of income and wealth inequality are really neither required nor desirable. Now, similarly, I believe under this whole neoliberal order, we have had an enormous increase in income and wealth inequality, which is neither required nor desirable. Okay. Therefore, on this, we have to take, I mean, obviously we have to have a public discourse, but in the public discourse, we don't have to build a consensus, including those who are going to be taxed away, getting their consent to being taxed away. That's not necessary, to my mind, just as it wasn't necessary when we instituted land reforms.
Good evening, sir. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. My question is this. Can you just list the examples of where this socialist model has worked in the world and where it came out as a successful economic model? Because when I read, I see the example of Venezuela, which one of the all exporters and became such a poor country now after becoming Hugo Chavez. In India, we have example of Bengal, which after deindustrialization have now it's lost its glory.
I'm not fully following what you are saying. If you could, sorry, yes.
So my question is this: what are the examples in the world where this model, which you're suggesting, has been successful?
In all over Europe in the post-Second World War period, they built welfare states. When I went to Oxford, the level of unemployment in Britain was less than 2%. But in the entire history of Britain, you never had such low unemployment. And what is more, everybody got unemployment allowance.
Its welfare model is same as socialism?
Sorry?
Is welfare model, like we see in Scandinavia, can we say term it that there's a socialism, a socialist state?
No, not at all. I mean, that's welfare model within capitalism. Because it's a welfare model within capitalism, capitalism is always trying to beat down the welfare measures which are instituted within its corpus. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, now you have a reversal of the welfare state measures almost all over Europe. Okay. There is an attempt to roll back all the gains that the working class had made in the post-Second World War period under social democracy, because that is, capitalism was too weak at that time to be able to roll back these gains or to prevent these gains from taking place. But on the other hand, now it is in a position to roll back, which is why you have many of these measures being rolled back.
So my last question, isn't it India followed the socialism till the liberation of the economy, and how that was in your view?
You see, when you say socialism, I don't want socialism to just become a catchword, okay? I mean, one has to be very clear about what one means by socialism. The way I see it is the following, that under capitalism, there is an innate tendency to roll back the welfare measures that you're talking, precisely like had been instituted in the post-Second World War period. Over time, you had what Marx had called centralization of capital, the formation of larger and larger blocks of capital, larger and larger blocks of finance, and this finance then decided to go global. And of course, when you have globalized finance facing a nation state, after all, these measures were measures which were instituted by a nation state. So if you have globalized finance facing a nation state, then globalized finance has the upper hand, because if the nation state doesn't do what globalized finance wants, then finance leaves, goes to some other place, starting a financial crisis in the country that had not listened to it. Therefore, the kind of upper hand which finance has in this kind of a situation, which in turn derives from the fact that in capitalism there is a spontaneous tendency to roll back the gains of the workers. At the moment, I would think of socialism as a system that is devoid of such a spontaneous tendency. Okay? And that in turn would really require the social ownership of the means of production.
You spoke about how capitalism has the clout now to roll back welfare models and so on. You've also spoken in the past before about recommendations to the UN on the global financial system. Could you talk about that? It's not possible to have economic rights without recognizing the role of global capital. So could you elaborate on how capitalism can be tackled possibly in terms of laws?
Yes, yes. You see, the point is that, the moment you do a thing like this, the moment you institute economic rights, by taxing the rich, there would be a tendency for finance to flow out of your country. Therefore, you would have to have capital controls. You have to have control, you have to control the outflow of finance. If you control the outflow of finance, then finance would not flow into your country. And if it doesn't flow into your country, then it becomes very difficult to be able to manage your current account balance of payments deficit. Therefore, you'll have to have some trade controls. You have to have some import controls. Therefore, this is something which is not possible. The rights I'm talking about are not possible within a neoliberal order, because a neoliberal order believes in relatively free flows of commodities, finance, capital across country borders. So it is not possible under a neoliberal order. But you therefore have to have some controls to begin with, controls on capital flows, controls on trade flows, and so on. Now, once you do that, then the capitalists may go on an investment strike. They may say that, look, we are now going to invest. Certainly multinationals are now into coming into your country to invest. They would rather go to Bangladesh or to Indonesia or wherever. There are no such restrictions on them. Now, if that is the case, then you'd have to activate the public sector to undertake the investment that the private sector would have otherwise undertaken. Therefore, what I'm suggesting is that the rights discourse, if we begin from there, then the kind of social arrangement which is required would have to be worked out in keeping with this discourse on rights. Okay, this is very different from saying, this is the opposite of saying that neoliberalism is good. So let us not muck about with neoliberalism by introducing all these rights. That's exactly what the Dworkin kind of position would be. Now, therefore, I would suggest, in fact, in my view, the fight for economic rights would actually recursively move you in a direction which I would call socialism. Therefore, I do not see Marx's opposition to the individual rights as being as something that we should actually take as a hurdle. Okay, because the very struggle for individual rights is something which can only succeed through collective effort. And if it does succeed, it would increasingly require a set of follow-up measures that would take us out of capitalism and therefore take us towards a more collectivist way of organizing the society.
Thank you, sir. I now welcome Professor C. Selvaraj, Chairman of the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, to speak a few words.
Distinguished Professor Prabhat Patnaik, invitees and guests, it's a matter of great pride for the Trust to have this program arranged, and we are very happy that the jury has nominated such a outstanding professor for the award. Professor Patnaik was saying that he is a grand student of Dr. Malcolm. I think Dr. Malcolm has motivated several outstanding economists, and Dr. Prabhat Patnaik has also many illustrious students. At a personal level, I can say Mr. Sashikumar and I are alumni of Madras Christian College, and Dr. Malcolm and Dr. K.N. Raj, teachers of Professor Prabhat Patnaik, taught at Madras Christian College. So you have an indirect connection with MCC also. We are very happy. And Dr. Patnaik's lecture today was highlighting the point how the market forces are presenting a big challenge to the economic rights. I think we are having a serious conflict between the economic democracy on the one hand and political democracy on the other. And what Ambedkar said, the trinity, the liberty, equality, and the way in which the people are treated irrespective of their social positions. Now we are slowly losing control of these economic rights due to many factors that are happening as a result of the market forces. Therefore, we are very grateful to Professor Prabhat Patnaik for highlighting that wealth generation is not important, but wealth distribution is more important than generation of wealth. We thank you, sir, for giving this very important lecture, which will go a long way for a reorientation of our economic policy. We thank the ACJ, we thank Mr. Sashikumar for making this possible. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir. I now call upon Professor Brinda Vishwanathan, trustee of the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, to propose the vote of thanks.
It's my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks for today's event. And reiterating from the citation, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, teacher non-parallel, a professional economist par excellence and an engaged citizen and a public intellectual. We cannot thank him less for his erudite exposition on this chosen topic, which I think is very, very relevant in the ongoing increasing wealth inequality at a time when capitalism has expanded quite dramatically all over the world. And we really need to rethink about the kind of social arrangements that he's talking about, probably inverting the pyramid that might keep the 1% at the bottom and then give all the rights up to the one at the top. We would like to mention our special thanks and gratitude to Mr. Sasi Kumar, Chairman, Media Development Foundation, Asian College of Journalism, for providing all the support, including this beautiful auditorium, for conducting the award function and talk that followed. Additionally, we would like to thank their administrative officer, Mrs. Malini, for providing all the assistance in conducting this event today. We thank all our distinguished guests and invitees for attending the event and enlivening the question and answer, particularly all our budding young journalists for whom the right to expression is, I think, very much a core part of your learning and your career. I hope you have learned enough from the kind of points that Professor has given you. But for the continuous effort of Mrs. Vasumati and Mrs. Vasanti, who are part of the administrative staff at the Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust, this event could not have been as successful and gone off as smoothly. Thank you. Thank you all once again. And on behalf of the trustees, thank you for participating in this event.